All right. So good to be back with you. And I'm going to pick up where we left off a week ago. And we're drawing close to the end of what's been a very long lecture series. And thank you for your patience in letting me work out my own ideas on this subject matter, where we've been thinking about political parties and democracy. And when political parties tend to support democracy, tend to want to play by the rules of the game, tend to want to not only hold power only when they have won fair and square, legitimate, free and open elections, but also support democratic institutions independently from the strategic advantage those institutions might confer or might not confer on those parties. And of course, the more difficult time for a political party to support democracy is when it looks like it's going to come out on the losing end. And alternatively, when it is that political parties seek to consolidate power at the expense of standing in the next election or to undermine the institutions that support electoral democracy. And of course, all of this motivated by a concern that not only do democracies tend to founder and fall when major political parties turn against them, but that something along these lines may be happening in the United States today. And we've taken a long journey. We've looked historically at the origin of the party system in this country and in many European modern representative democracies. We've looked at some of the sociological as well as the philosophical literature on political parties. We've looked at the history of conservative parties, the history of American parties, and finally, in the last couple of weeks, we've transferred to 21st century America. And I've been using Ezra Klein's wonderful book, Why We're Polarized, as a jumping off place for synthesizing some ideas about what's driving partisan polarization in general and into the specific forms it's taking in 21st century America, why in particular we seem to be so deeply fractured or divided, why our political partisan identity seems to be subsuming many of our other social identities, including racial, geographic, religious, and ideological identities, and how that's unique and disruptive in American history. And so we focused in particular on Ezra Klein's, I think, very trenchant analysis of the racial dynamics behind partisan polarization that the Democratic Party over the course of the last 50 or 60 years has succeeded in reconstituting itself as a genuine interracial coalition party or multiracial coalition party, and that the Republican Party has not succeeded in making that transition. And so it remains a largely 90%, to be specific, white party. And given the demographic changes in the composition of the electorate, that puts the Republican Party in an increasingly difficult position in which, in order to win elections, it really has to mobilize its shrinking base to vote. And to do that, it increasingly presents the other party and those who support the other party as hostile, un-American, dangerous, and in increasingly conspiratorial tones. And that in a sense, that is one of the major factors driving polarization, as well as driving the Republican Party into increasingly anti-competitive electoral strategies. That is to say, strategies that involve making it more difficult for people to vote or gaming the system such that they can hold power while winning only a minority of the overall vote nationally or in a particular state. And of course, the combination of the Senate, the Electoral College, the way in which we district and our election system facilitates the Republican Party in thinking that it can win without reconstituting itself. And as we'll see today, some of Ezra Klein's conclusions have to do with trying to remove the incentive that the Republican Party currently has to mobilize a nearly exclusively white base and to try to get it to reconstitute itself as a modern 21st century conservative party that draws in a variety of voters, especially a more multiracial coalition. We then transitioned into talking about political psychology and work that really has been done primarily in the last 20 years, which builds on the foundational work in social psychology done by thinkers like Muzaffar Sharif or Henri Tachfel on the tendency of human beings to categorize our social world into us and them, in group and out group, and to show decided favoritism to the group that we belong to view the other group, the outside group, as threatening, as hostile, as dangerous, as impure, as corrupt, and the way in which this shapes and distorts our thinking about other people, and thinking about the issues related to identity. If certain policy positions tend to function as markers of that identity. If to be Republican, to take a contemporary example, is to be anti-vaccine. And I'm sure you've seen there's a growing tendency among mainstream Republicans, especially at the state level, to criticize the coronavirus vaccine as inadequately tested and potentially dangerous and having all kinds of frankly kooky side effects like magnetizing you so that you then can be traced by cell towers. I mean, just kind of really kooky stuff that is being invited into the halls of power in places like Ohio, right? You know, not necessarily the boondocks of our country. And in Tennessee, you've probably seen that the state led by Republicans has managed to convince its public health agency to stop promoting not only the coronavirus vaccine, but vaccines altogether. If being anti-vaccine becomes a marker of your political identity, one of the things that constitutes the totem of the tribe, if you will, then you will bend your thinking to support that conclusion, right? And so this idea of identity protective cognition, that when an idea, a claim, a proposition says that a belief that serves as the basis for the cohesion of your group is false, you will find that proposition to be threatening, but you will also find all kinds of ways to find fault with or refute that claim and support the opposite, right? And so it's not just that we are increasingly huddled in hostile partisan camps, unable or unwilling to cooperate or compromise with each other. It's that it's distorting our very cognitive processes. And among other things, it's leading us to exaggerate the extent of our disagreement. There are genuine ideological disagreements that map onto partisan disagreements in the United States. But frankly, the ideological disagreements by themselves do not explain the extent of our polarization, mutual hostility, and animosity. As opposed to that, it appears that we exaggerate the extent of our policy differences and our ideological disagreement because we view ourselves as an in-group where everything that the out-group view has as a view must be wrong-headed and hostile to us. And so this then maps on to what Klein is saying about race, but further amplifies the dangerous tendencies of racial polarization by allowing them to tap into some very deep social psychological tendencies in the way in which we group and categorize in our social worlds. So that's where we left off last week. And I'm not going to belabor this, but this diagram, which I've shown you before, which I generated to try to synthesize some of the work on political psychology, suggests that we may be entering a world in which psychological differences are as important as ideological differences, that people who have what might be called an authoritarian personality, who don't like rapid social or cultural change, who find it threatening and disorienting, may be demanding that authority be used to reimpose tradition when tradition loses its organic, unself-conscious power. And that may be part of what's transforming the Republican Party. If it becomes a party that is a party of tradition and of imposing tradition, I think you have a pretty good explanation for why, for instance, banning trans athletes from high school sports has become a cause celeb in many state Republican parties right now. Why, similarly, the effort to police abortion is becoming increasingly enforced, at least in the case of Texas, at the community or individual level and not just at the state level. I think this political psychological perspective helps us to understand a lot of what's going on in our world, and then to think more in terms of this idea of identity protecting cognition. Among the issues that polarization is distorting our perception of reality on, obviously the vaccine. And as you can see, I think this number has actually moved down. I think it's now 47% of Republicans indicate if they haven't got the vaccine already that they will. As the Delta variant becomes the dominant variant in the United States, this is creating pockets of real susceptibility to a resurgence of the coronavirus again. This is, in other words, putting lives at stake, the way in which partisan polarization is distorting our thinking about something as important as a public health emergency. Similarly, we face an existential crisis in climate change. I think, to put it most directly, we now for really the first time in human history, I think should consider it likely, probable, that the human species may go extinct on the planet. We see it in the floods that just occurred in Europe and the wildfires that rage every year across the West, in all of the mega storms, etc. Not to mention the record temperatures, which I know you guys have not been suffering, but I'm suffering at the moment. And yet it turns out that a significant portion of the population still does not believe that climate change is real. That's shrinking, by the way, in light of the actual experience of these events. But when we look at conservative Republicans, more of them believe that government action is counterproductive when it comes to climate change than believe that it is productive. It's roughly 50-50, whereas we look at liberal Democrats, over 80% believe that government action is productive and only 7% believe that it's counterproductive. And if we were to drill down on that, I'm sure we would find that the people who believe it's counterproductive believe so for very different reasons. Probably that it's not radical enough, or that it's not taking aggressive enough strategies, as opposed to the conservative Republicans who don't believe that the government does any good on most issues, especially culture war issues. And so this then raises the question, if I'm right, and I hope I'm not, but I think that the evidence is overwhelming that we face a genuine existential threat, a threat to the future of humanity on the planet in climate change. How can it be that we can't reckon with that, at least come together on this issue? How did climate change become a culture war issue? And here I think that this category of identity protective cognition and motivated reasoning only to the conclusions that you want to reach or that you already agree with, are extremely helpful. So let me give you a couple quotes from Ezra Klein. The first, from page 102, says Dan Cahan, and remember he's a law professor at Yale University who does work in political psychology. Dan Cahan's work suggests that cognition exists on a spectrum, ranging from issues where truth matters and our identities don't. What's the temperature outside, right? To issues where our identities dominate and truth fades in importance. One implication of an era where our political identities are becoming more sordid and more powerful is that it will bring with it a rise in identity protective cognition. And that's particularly true if the relevant identity groups are able to construct sophisticated architectures of information that we can use to power our reasoning. I will get into the details of this in a few minutes, but I'm sure you recognize the allusion to filter bubbles, to a fractured media environment in which we primarily subscribe to, watch, take in media that confirm our pre-existing beliefs and identities, that this has become the dominant business model for the political media in the 21st century. And that gives us the grist for our identity protective cognition mills, right? Plenty of information to suggest that the vaccines are dangerous if you watch Tucker Carlson, right, etc. So then the second quote, Cahan is quick to note that most of the time people are perfectly capable of being convinced by the best evidence. There's a lot of disagreement about climate change and gun control, but almost none over whether antibiotics work. Let's hope that stays the case. Our reasoning becomes rationalizing when we're dealing with questions where the answer could threaten our group. And in those cases, Cahan says, we're being perfectly rational when we fool ourselves. Now that's an interesting claim, right? We're being perfectly rational when we fool ourselves. Does anybody have a take on that or an idea what he means? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I'm just trying to be as interactive as possible. I'll put
rationality is internal, then yes. If you consider yourself rational if you believe these things, it has nothing to do with truth.
Yeah. Or, go ahead, Flossie.
The heart has its reasons that reason knows nothing of.
Yes, thank you for that, Flossie. Always able to bring the poetics in. I was reading Heidegger the other day talking about reason as the stiff-necked faculty of the mind, right? Yeah. There's that whole romantic tradition of saying there's a lot more to thinking than reason. John, go ahead.
It's certainly rational for a Republican candidate for office to believe practically anything.
Or at least to publicly report that they believe anything, right? And so one of the things that you hear a lot from Washington, D.C. reporters is that many Republicans, when they speak off the record, will indicate that they in fact believe that climate change is real and dangerous and caused by our greenhouse emissions. And yet they can't say that publicly. They can't say that on the record because it's electoral suicide. And they think that somebody even worse than them will be elected if they go on the record on that position. So
that's true enough, but even Republicans are subject to cognitive dissonance. And the more you say something, the more you're likely to come to believe it. If it's convenient for you to believe it, as politicians have known forever, you're likely to come around to that view.
Interesting idea, because when you said cognitive dissonance, I was thinking the other way around, right? You know, that Republican congressmen have grandchildren too, right? And their grandchildren are going to have to live on the planet that we are rapidly altering in ways that's going to make it much less inhabitable for them. Maybe that's a different kind of cognitive dissonance. And by the way, the strategy to convert Republican voters to acknowledging and wanting to prioritize climate change as an issue seems to be focusing on women and children right now, and using that leverage of cognitive dissonance. If you are a good mother, don't you want your children and their children to be able to lead something like the life you're leading? And if so, aren't you worried with what you're seeing from these storms, fires, heat, etc., that may not be possible in the future? To leverage the idea of family values against climate change. But yes, so there's the other path, which in a sense is much more consonant with what Klein is saying. If you have to believe something, you may eventually persuade yourself that you do believe it. I want to just give one more gloss, and I like the ways in which you've interpreted that passage. One more gloss to Klein's claim that in a sense it's rational to be irrational in this case. And that is, in a sense, if you think about it, John's example, if you're a Republican and you say out loud that you don't believe in climate change, I'm sorry, if you're a Republican elected official and you say out loud that you don't believe in climate change, you may lose your job. But if you are in a relatively segregated political community, and if your friendship circle, perhaps your informal network that helps you to get your job or your promotion or to sell your goods, depends on people thinking that you're one of us, you're one of the good guys, right? And that part of being one of us includes being a Republican. And part of being a Republican includes having the right views on climate change. Then you may end up deciding, or maybe it's not even conscious, maybe it's subconscious, that protecting that identity is more important than getting to the right answer about a particular issue, right? And so the deep rationality involves, in a sense, preserving your sense of self. This is who I am. This is what makes me who I am. Your sense of social belonging. This is what makes me part of the community that I'm in. Your standing in that community, which may be central to your social esteem or self-worth, right? And so that the cognitive and psychological decks are stacked on the side of maintaining the belief that is a marker of your identity and belonging in a social group. When the social group isn't just your bridge club, that might be important to you too, but is an in-group defined against an out-group, right? Is that making sense, I hope? I think it's an interesting point. And I'll just point out to you very quickly, let me get back into the slides, that although Ezra Klein is primarily relying on Dan Cahan, and you'll excuse me for the similarities in the name, Daniel Kahneman has done a lot of research that eventually won him a Nobel Prize in economics, to suggest that a lot of our reasoning uses heuristics or biases and shortcuts. And so if you're a Republican, and if a Republican believes that climate change is false, I must believe climate change is false, is a pretty good example of the kind of heuristic that Kahneman believes is characteristic of much system one or fast thinking that human beings do. And I'll hopefully be talking with you in more detail about these guys at some point in the distant, not too distant future. Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber have done really interesting work on the evolution of reason. And their suggestion is, and it's of course speculative, but I think it's quite persuasive, that reason probably did not evolve as a problem solving mechanism. That's a byproduct, an advantage of having the capacity to construct complex arguments and scrutinize the way in which they're organized, but that it's more likely to have evolved as a way of discerning who is in the in group and who is in the out group, who can reproduce the myth that gives us our tribal identity in a convincing way. If we're trying to figure out if you're friend or foe, one of the best ways to do that is to question you and to make sure that you get the stories right that make us us, and don't betray that you actually believe those things that make them them, right? And so this idea that sometimes it is rational not to use your reason to solve a problem or to get to the truth, but to use your reason to mark your identity and demonstrate your belonging, appears to have deep roots in human psychology, and to be, in a sense, structuring of the way the ways in which human cognition work. I've got one more thing to say, and this is to bring us back to themes we've talked about before, may talk about again, the level of inequality in the United States, right? And it may seem like a peculiar detour in the middle of thinking about partisanship and climate change and identity protective cognition. But I'll just point out to you, right, that this diagram, which we've looked at together before, I know it's not the most elegant diagram, but what it shows is that over the last 40 years, and by the way, at some point in the not too distant future, we'll talk about what's happening today. There may be slightly different things happening today in the economy and its distributive effects. But for most of the last 20 years, the vast majority of the wealth that's been earned in our society has been highly concentrated in the top 0.01% and the top 1%. If you're in the top 90th percent, you're essentially keeping up with the growth of the economy. But if you're in the bottom 50%, you've been totally left out of this wealth creation. And the relevance in the context of polarization around climate change is, I think it's very understandable in a sense that someone would say, look, you're talking about something that's going to be a problem 20 years from now. I've got a problem today. I can't pay my rent. I can't make my mortgage payment. I'm not able to put enough food on the table for my kids. I'm not able to afford my medical bills or my car repair, right? That it seems like a high class problem to be worried about climate change when so many people are worried about basic economic insecurity. And that again gives it that class war feel, culture war issue. And you add to that the kind of people who are best informed about climate change tend to be people with college educations, who live in major cities, and pretty soon you're talking about mainly people who are in the top 90%, or at least likely to be in that demographic or strata. You are again reinforcing the idea that this is a problem of people like them, not of people like us, or caring about this problem is a marker of people like them. People like us, we care more about immediate bottom line issues and generating the economic growth that might get us out of this bad situation. And so this points to the stickiness of policy issues in an environment in which we have become polarized. In a sense, it's going to be hard to get a great deal of headway on climate change, to make it less of a partisan and more of a bipartisan or consensus issue, unless we can also do something about the distribution of wealth and income in our society. And of course, polarization leads to paralysis in the American system. And so it's very hard to pass legislation that does anything about this. And as you are aware, the Democrats have just put together their $3.5 billion budget proposal, which is designed to do something about this, among other things. And we'll have to just look and see, wait and see what its prospects are. It's a very tenuous path to passing that legislation. So having surveyed the results of psychological polarization with regards to vaccination and climate change, let me first point to some of the concluding reflections on polarization that Klein offers us, and then point to some of his positive recommendations as a way to begin transitioning into what we can do in 2021 to address partisan polarization. So first major conclusion is that party affiliation no longer expresses underlying disagreements, if it ever did, so much as causing the disagreement. And so the claim here, right, is because we see the other partisan group as an outgroup, we become convinced that they must be different from us. This is part of the way social perception operates, is to accentuate the similarities within the in-group and accentuate the differences from the out-group. Ileana Mason, whose work I've talked with you about before, shows that our perceptions of partisan disagreement are actually much sharper than the underlying policy disagreement that opinion polls detect among the American electorate. We think we disagree more on tax policy or immigration policy or trade war issues, etc., than we actually do. If you were to remove the label, that's a Republican position or that's a Democrat position, and just look at the position, we would find that we agree on much more than we think we agree on. And so it's not the case that we disagree and therefore we're sorting ourselves into parties. We're sorted into parties and therefore we disagree. The second claim, and it's closely related, and I think of this as perhaps the best way of synthesizing Robert Frank's What's the Matter with Kansas, for those of you who are familiar with that book. It argues that people in Kansas would clearly benefit from supporting Democrats in terms of their material interest, in terms of the kinds of tax policy, social welfare policy, etc., that Democrats support. The people of Kansas should be voting Democratic, but they don't. They vote Republican largely. Why? And Frank, in a sense, kind of shrugs his shoulders. What in the world is wrong with these people? What Klein argues, and I think it's very important, is that at this moment in our political history, explained by this account of political psychology, expressive interests are more important than material interests. Saying, I belong to this group, this is the kind of person I am, is what one is doing when one votes. It's not a calculus. Which of these two parties better supports the needs and interests of people like me. No, that's not what's going on. Because partisan identity is the primary source of polarization, we end up voting on the basis of our identity, not on the basis of our interests. And here, Henri Tajfel has very interesting work on what at one point he calls the relentless spiral of rational and irrational forms of group conflicts, right? And so there's some minor difference between the groups on their interests. They then fall into two groups, they start treating each other as outgroups, and then they become much more hostile to each other in ways that far exceed the initial rational basis for conflict, right? And part of what Tajfel is interested in, what he shows in his experiments, is it's very often the case that we are willing to damage our material self-interest if it allows us to damage the interests of the outgroup, of the others, even more, right? So we'll take a sacrifice to our interests if we can make sure that the damage to the other group exceeds the damage to our group. And again, this is a very different kind of rationality than I think most people who defend democracy assume that voters engage in when deciding who to support politically. Third big conclusion, that outgroup hostility and in-group favoritism are rooted in deep primitive regions of the brain that when activated tend to bypass more evolved centers of cognition. And again, you can do this in the laboratory. The social psychologists, the political psychologists do this. They use fMRI, magnetic resonance imaging, to see where the activity in the brain is going on. And when you frame an issue as a partisan issue, the activity leaves the frontal cortex, the problem-solving area, and it goes down into the animal or lizard portions of the brain, the parts of the brain that are active in fight or flight or freeze kind of reactions. And that suggests, again, that we're not thinking clearly when we are engaged in this kind of partisan conflict. So having reviewed and synthesized in that way, let me then get into some of the further conclusions of Klein's analysis. One of them is to look at the forms of justified partiality and discrimination in the contemporary United States. And I'm adding a little bit here, partiality to one's own children, right? And in many respects, this seems to be justified, but Robert Putnam, in his wonderful book from a few years ago, Our Kids, points out that we've become much more competitive in the way in which we try to show favoritism to our own kids. It's not just that we love them more than the neighbor's kids, but that we're going to try to make sure they get into a better college than the neighbor's kids. And that means spending a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of energy in making them as qualified and competitive as possible to gain access to that education. And that for the most part, we're not critical of this. I for one, think we have that we're making a mistake when we do that. If we were saying we want all white kids to succeed and Black and Latino kids, to hell with them, obviously alarm bells would go off and there would be a lot of criticism. But when it's just my kids, we tend to overlook the systemic effects of preferring our own children. Sports would be perhaps a more innocent example of justified partiality and discrimination. We like our team and dislike our team's rivals, and that's okay. We can get together in groups of 50,000 or more and scream at the top of our lungs and all is good and well. I don't know if that's releasing or actually fomenting this kind of discriminatory attitude. I didn't put it on the list, but I've been thinking about beauty as well, or attractiveness. And there's lots of research that shows that people who are considered to be more attractive get all kinds of advantages in terms of wages, in terms of opportunities, in terms of favorable impressions, in terms of judgments of trustworthiness, etc. Again, this seems to be an area where we discriminate, and we're rather unself-conscious about the fact that we discriminate. And then finally, in terms of partisan identity, that this is another area where it's fine to be openly hostile to the other group, to have stereotypes, to engage in ridicule, etc. And especially if Klein is right, that in certain respects, partisan identity has become a surrogate for racial identity, then we've got to worry that this is yet another form of dog whistling, or another form that coded discrimination is taking in our society. And part of synthesizing all of this is to suggest that this tendency to divide the social world into us and them is deeply rooted in the human mind, and once activated, powerful and pernicious. If certain avenues of outing and othering are closed down, will we tend to want to find other avenues? And that's obviously a distressing conclusion for people who are more cosmopolitan or more universalist and hope for a world in which we stop discriminating altogether. Fifth idea, identity guides and shapes cognition, right? That's obviously familiar from what we've just been talking about. And we've created information ecosystems that reinforce this tendency. And so that goes back to the quote from Klein I showed you a couple slides back. How is this working? And at one point he suggests that the media at this point are tribal leaders as much as our elected officials are. And again, Klein emphasizes structural factors, factors to do with the fact that we've moved very rapidly from a world in terms of the economy of the media, in which we have a few outlets, a few newspapers, etc., into a world in which we have just a huge proliferation of media outlets. And that's true because we can get any newspaper in the world on our computer or our phone. It's true because we now have cable TV, and that means as opposed to a few channels, we have hundreds of channels. And of course, it's true because we have the internet and social media, which allows, in a sense, our phones that are with us everywhere we go to be funnels that allow in information from thousands or millions of content creators. And the result is that there's hyper competition in the new media economic system. And that what this tends to generate is a new model of media business in which you do your very best to attract a very loyal, if perhaps narrow, audience. And that the people who are producing news media are not only competing with other news media channels, but they're competing with sports channels and entertainment channels and TikTok and Facebook, etc., right? And so the idea of getting something that is sensational, that is spectacular, that channels or activates deep emotions, that makes you angry or anxious or frustrated, all of that seems to be encouraged by this new media environment. And hence, there is a strong tendency both to ideological segregation within the media and to radicalization. If you're competing for that small group of people who thinks that climate, I shouldn't say small, unfortunately it's not, but for that group of people who think that climate change is a left-wing conspiracy designed to damage the economic interests of people like you, you're going to be competing to be more and more radical in the way in which you broadcast and support that view. And we see this, right, with the increased radicalization of especially right-wing populists in social media environs today. And this then is further amplified by the fact that the way in which a lot of this content is funneled to you is structured by algorithms, and that those algorithms very efficiently figure out what gets your eyes on the screen and keeps them there. And often that's the very same thing as what gets your blood boiling. And so Gia Tolentino of the New Yorker has written a good book recently, Trick Mirror. That's her metaphor for what the cell phone is, especially when the cell phone is a conduit for social media. And her idea is that the principle of media organization is opposition. That in a sense, in consuming whatever media you're consuming, you're as much saying what you're not as what you are. And that this then is making it much easier to engage in identity protective cognition, because all the information you need is going to come streaming into your phone to believe what it is that your side is supposed to believe, and probably very little of the information that contradicts that is going to come in. And so this then is the way in which Klein concludes this point, is that changed media are changing us. Quote, identity-oriented content will deepen the identities it repeatedly triggers, right? And so that's what social media, what even broadcast media are increasingly doing, catering to the identity of individuals who are already polarized, and that is going to deepen the sense of the importance of that identity and the hostility to those who don't share that identity. And so in these circumstances, politics and information make us stupid. And this is, I think, a major challenge for people like me who tend to be deliberative Democrats, right? Or who believe that one of the good things about democracy is that it forces us to confront and listen to and argue with the other side, and that we tend to refine our beliefs and learn in the process, that our bad arguments get exposed, that the good arguments of the other side also come to the fore, and that in the process of debating with other people, we end up learning, becoming smarter, becoming more open, becoming better at devising policy to solve the problems that we, upon reflection, conclude are the genuine problems we face. And if, as opposed to doing that, we're merely collecting information to bolster our identity and the beliefs that are markers of our identities, then maybe we shouldn't be as surprised at how bad and destructive contemporary politics tend to be. And again, here it seems to me that Klein is giving us a very important framework for understanding aspects of our politics that might otherwise bewilder us. The conclusion that I emphasized, I think, at the beginning last week is that we are increasingly in a post-persuasion election environment. And so people who talk about this tend to put the dividing line around 2004, that in the 1980s, 1990s, early aughts of this century, people were talking about undecided or swing voters in swing states. If you remember, for a while, we were talking about soccer moms as the kind of epitome of the voter who tends to live in the suburbs, in the swing states, and who makes up their mind election by election and who you need to reach and persuade in order to win the election. And that model of voting, persuasion voting, has been in retreat since the early 2000s, and people who are political consultants as well as political scientists say that the new model of winning elections is not persuading the undecided or the independent or the swing voter, because they're just vanishingly few of those people. In this hyper polarized environment we live in, it's very hard to switch sides. And so as opposed to that, if the person in question isn't enthusiastic or excited by the candidate on their side or the policy positions they've staked, they may stay home, right? But they're not going to switch sides. And so then what becomes important, the new model of electioneering, is base motivation. Get the people who are on your side so excited, so enthusiastic, or frankly, easier and more reliable, so scared and so angry that they're going to get off their duffs and vote, right? That's the way you win an election. It's not persuading the unpersuadable, it's motivating the already motivated. And so this change in our motivations changes election strategy. And it also has additional effects. Remember where we started with Klein, his observation that Donald Trump, despite being in many respects a radical departure from traditional Republicans, basically carried the same voters in the same places that John McCain and Mitt Romney carried. He just got a few more people who were like the people who had voted for McCain and Romney to vote for him, right? And so that suggests, again, that Trump understood and was willing to utilize strategies to take advantage of the pre-existing tendencies in the electorate, rather than persuading people who were in the middle to come over to his side. And that the further effect of this is, and this is ironic, it takes a little bit of while, I think, that to wrap your head around, that we're getting two things at once. Very strong partisanship. People's partisan identities have become essential to who they think they are, uncompromising and hostile, and weak political parties. And the political parties are actually weakened by the growing strength of partisanship, in part because there aren't undecided voters, right? If there are undecided voters, then the party can poll them and figure out through discussion groups, et cetera, what kinds of issues the politicians need to be emphasizing in order to swing the swing voter, right? And that gives the partisan officials, the professional strata who does the polling and who formulates the platform, a certain influence over candidates. But in this environment in which whoever wins the nomination is going to win the votes of the partisans, and the only question is how many, the party becomes weaker. This is especially the case in light of popular primaries, where the party no longer has the capacity to choose the candidate. It has to see which candidate the people prefer. And I want to suggest that as we now get into the more positive portion of this class, right? You know, and calling the lecture series a class or a course, I'm trying to lead us together through a whole thought exercise in what we should do about partisanship and polarization, negative partisanship in particular in the 21st century. One of the things we should be thinking about as we try to solve that problem is this issue that we have become more partisan, and in so doing, we have in fact weakened our political parties. We encountered, when we looked at Daniel Ziblatt's work, this hypothesis that strong parties tend to be pro-democratic parties because they think they can play the game and win, and they tend to then moderate their politicians to keep at arm's length insurgent anti-democratic elements. And if the kind of partisanship we have, which is strong and very deeply rooted in social psychological tendencies, ironically actually weakens parties, that may help us to begin to think through what is it that we could do to simultaneously perhaps alter the nature of partisanship and change political parties to make them stronger. That's at least where I would like us to begin our reflections on what we should be doing about this when we get together next week. Let me ask, I've covered again a lot of territory today. Anybody have a question, a comment, a thought?
Yes, I do.
Flossie, go ahead.
Is Biden heading in this direction?
So by this direction, you mean the direction of
that you are pointing out?
Becoming a polarizing figure, or
Or is he, is he moving slightly away, more than slightly away from the polarizing figure?
Yes, so good. And I think clearly early in his administration, his guiding approach was to depolarize. And so many people, including Ezra Klein in the Times, commented on the fact that when he passed his stimulus and recovery bill, he didn't call it the Biden stimulus and recovery bill. He didn't call it a Democratic stimulus and recovery bill. He called it the American stimulus and recovery bill. He mainly stayed out of the limelight in promoting it. He mainly refrained from taking victory laps once it passed. Now, having said all of that, and so all that would indicate that he tried to make himself less focal, and he tried to make the party less focal, and that he seems to, in a sense, have digested a fair bit of this, and to recognize that the best way to get legislation passed and the best way to not, if you will, provoke the other side's hostility is to lay low and just concentrate on legislating and let the benefits of the legislation demonstrate to the people who would otherwise oppose it that it actually is done for their benefit, not just for the benefit of the other side. So at points, I think that Biden seems to be taking a very different strategy than Donald Trump took, and that we can maybe hope that this could be the start of a long unwinding of partisan polarization. But having said that, let me just point out, it's really hard to resist the desire to take that victory lap, to claim credit, to trumpet one's accomplishments. And I think you're seeing some of this in Biden, and I think it's a natural political imperative. If he never says, I got things done and they're good for you, how's he going to get reelected? Right? How's he going to help the Democrats to retain control of Congress in 2022, et cetera? And so, right, in a two-party system, if you don't, when you're the head of your party because you're president, trumpet your party's accomplishments and talk down the other side, as he did, for instance, in his speech last week in Philadelphia on voter suppression legislation. If you don't attack and defend, then you may be unilaterally disarmed. And so I think this comes back to Klein's central claim that this is structural, that it's hard to resist this. But having said all that, I think Biden clearly gets it and understands that in a sense, polarization is much better for the Republicans than it is for the Democrats. Better for them because they are better at playing the cards of fear and anger. And, you know, there's this kind of alternation in American politics between negative and positive political emotions. Is it hope and confidence, or is it fear and anger? And also because the Democrats want to legislate. They want to get laws passed. And in order to legislate, they either have to have strong majorities or some kind of bipartisan cooperation. And polarization certainly doesn't help them to have bipartisan cooperation. So there are—
Thank you for that.
Yeah, you bet, Flossie. And I can see in the chat that there's a comment or a question from Ruth Campbell this time. One of the things we have done, which has been very helpful, is to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal as well as the Times and the Chronicle. It's been very helpful to read opposing positions and sometimes change or challenge our thinking. Yeah, I completely agree with that, Ruth. And I would just point out to you, as hard as it might be, as bad as it might be for your blood pressure or indigestion, watching Fox News every now and then. And
Yes.
I will tell you that I'm not doing it much these days. To be honest, I very rarely turn on the TV except when I'm watching European soccer or the NBA these days. But having said that, during the election, I was forcing myself to watch around half an hour of Fox News every night. You know, it's in many ways, it's an exercise in being affronted and outraged, but it's important to see what a large portion of Americans are seeing on a daily basis, where they're getting their information, what they're hearing. The Times and the Wall Street Journal are very reasoned mainstream publications. They do have ideological differences and they're important, but they also have, I think, a shared commitment to certain professional norms of journalism. And so they're not probably fabricating very much. Whereas I think Fox News is much more in this identity confirmation model of journalism. And so that's another reason not just to limit yourself to the Wall Street Journal. I can see John wants to follow up on Ruth's comment, right?
Yeah, we were actually talking about it last week after the lecture. The thing is that I actually find myself agreeing with far more, and I'm only talking about the editorial page and the op-ed page in the Wall Street Journal, not their news stories are actually frequently better than the New York Times.
Yep.
Their news is less slanted than the New York Times news is slanted, in my opinion. But I disagree mostly with the Wall Street Journal, but I agree with it and disagree with the Times position more often than I would have thought. Whether that's because I'm getting older or what, it's hard to say. I mean, you're supposed to get more conservative as you get older, but a lot of things that they say make a lot of sense. Of course, one of their big ones is you know, these, in a lot of ways, their attacks are kind of political and unreasonable, but about cancel culture or on free speech on campuses and on a lot of positions like that, where I basically agree with them much more than myself. But anyway, it's interesting, and you start out reading it and kind of giggling at it, and then, you know, it kind of grows on you. I'm not like worried about learning about what other Americans are thinking. I'm worried about what I'm thinking myself, and it's been instructive.
Thank you for those comments, John. And yes, I don't know if we grow more conservative as we get older, or we stay where we are and the subsequent generation becomes more progressive or more radical, right? But yes, that's a well-known phenomenon. And by all means, if you're reading the Wall Street Journal, I hope that you're open to being persuaded, right? Watching Fox News is for me often an exercise in reconnaissance, right? Every now and then there's a comment where I say, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. But the vast majority of the time I'm just saying, oh boy, so that's what they're saying. Now I know where that's coming from, or what's motivating that odd behavior on the part of that politician. I'm frankly not very sympathetic, even if I'm forcing myself to listen to it. But when it comes to the Wall Street Journal, yes, it's a Murdoch publication. Yes, it has an editorial slant. I completely agree with you. The news is better. The domestic, and I don't mean better than the Times. I just mean it's good, well-reported news. I'm not sure I've got a strong opinion about which one has better coverage. I think the culture stuff in the Times is often very good. Sometimes the financial and political stuff in the Wall Street Journal is better. And so you should be open-minded and open to being persuaded. You shouldn't criticize yourself because you're changing your mind every now and then.
The other point for the Journal is that Peggy Noonan is the best political column writer in America right now, I think.
Yeah,
and very sharp and entertaining.
The other thing I think it's worthwhile pointing out is neither David Brooks nor Russ Duhat is much of a conservative anymore, at least not given where the Republican Party has gone. So the so-called conservatives in the Times editorial pages are not really doing much service to their side anymore. Anyone else? Thank you, as always. Take care, and I will see you next week. Bye, everybody. Have good days. Enjoy your weekends. Thank you.
Everyone. Bye.